Welcome to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Spin-Off, Handwoven, Piecework, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. Trinway Silks is where weavers, spinners, knitters, and stitchers find the silk they love. Select from the largest variety of silk spinning fibers, silk yarn, and silk threads and ribbons at trinwaysilks.com. You'll discover a rainbow of colors thoughtfully hand-dyed in Colorado. Love natural? Trinway's array of wild silks provide choices beyond white. If you love silk, you'll love Trinway Silks, where superior quality and customer service are guaranteed. Brown Sheep Company is a 4-generation family business bringing you high-quality wool and natural fiber yarns. We spin and dye U.S.-grown wool into hundreds of vibrant colors at our mill in western Nebraska. Our mill has something to offer for every craft, from our well-known knitting and crocheting yarns to wool roving for spinning and felting. We offer U.S.-made needlepoint yarn as well as yarn on cones for weaving projects. Learn more about our company and products at brownsheep.com. I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder Ann Marrow. Nicole Nehrig is a clinical and research psychologist and passionate knitter living in Brooklyn, New York. She holds a PhD in clinical psychology. So Nicole, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you work on a subject that is, of course, near and dear to my heart and all of our listeners' hearts, which is craft and handwork and women's work, but you approach it with a little bit different lens. Can you tell me about approaching women's work as a psychologist?
Yeah. So, it's very intertwined with my own work as a knitter and doing some sewing and dabbling in various textile arts and really thinking about an interest in how we make meaning in our lives. And this is something that I talk with patients about all the time as a therapist. And I've really come from a kind of psychological, theoretical background that is, life is inherently meaningless. It's up to us to create the meaning and figure out ways to manage the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Some of us find ourselves in better circumstances than others. And what can we make out of what we're given to work with? And, there are some beautiful parallels there in our crafting world too. We have the pieces of fabric we have, or we have the yarn that we have. And, how do we transform it into the most beautiful or meaningful or useful thing that we can? So I really have found so much meaning in it myself in this work. It's been a metaphor for me in so many ways. It's been something that tells me a lot about who I am and what's going on with me that I can check in on and say, I'm doing this thing in my knitting. What does that tell me about what's going on in my life or what I'm needing in my life? Or why am I feeling this resistance to this particular project? I'm scared of messing up, or I'm scared of trying this hard thing, or I'm getting to a point in the project where I have to really problem solve and I just don't have the brain power for that right now. I'm just going to set it aside and cast on a simple shawl or something. But it really converged for me in a very intense kind of way during the pandemic. Before the pandemic, throughout grad school, I really knew that it was providing something important for me. It was a foil to my work as a therapist and helped me do something that was tangible, that was grounded, that was something I could fix when I didn't always feel like I could fix things in the therapy, or I could spend an hour in therapy and not get very far or not feel like we had made much progress, but I could spend an hour knitting and see my scarf grow, my sweater grow. So it was always this thing that kind of helped balance or helped meet needs that weren't being met in other parts of my life. But this really came to a head during the pandemic when life just really became reorganized in sometimes wonderful and sometimes very difficult ways. But everything was very focused on the home. I was locked down with 2 small children and my husband. We both had full-time jobs. I had a full-time hospital job as a staff psychologist, researcher, professor, busy job. So trying to juggle that with childcare and all the household responsibilities meant that I had really no time for myself. that was not either spent in work in some capacity, either seeing patients, students, supervisees, being in research meetings, or with my kids. And knitting was something that I could fit in the cracks of these things. So it was something I could do for myself while doing other things. And it was really like the thing that I had that could give me the meaning I needed during that time. Being with the kids was very meaningful. We were baking, we were having some fun, but it was also hard. And I was cleaning a lot and doing a lot of laundry, doing things that like didn't really feel like they had the substance to give me a lot of satisfaction for the things that I was craving. And, my work was work, and I was holding my patients' anxieties about the pandemic, my students' anxieties. We were all kind of in that together. And that felt connecting in some ways, but it also didn't allow me a lot of room for creative exploration, intellectual exploration, but knitting did. And I was, despite having no time, really, I was like the most productive I ever was as a knitter during that time. And I took on increasingly challenging projects. I did more complex color work projects. I had never knit socks before, and I taught myself how to knit socks. These things that I just like, I needed to fulfill these cravings for intellectual satisfaction that really had been satisfied through my work prior to that. And research kind of ground to a halt during that time. So that was a lot of where I got satisfaction for creative and intellectual and problem solving, all that stuff. But I was getting it through knitting, and it really surprised me like how fulfilling it was and how grounding it was and how many needs it was satisfying that I could fit in along the sides of other things. And it made me think about just what has this work meant for women throughout history. And we didn't have a lot of opportunities, men or women, really, for deep intellectual or creative satisfaction in careers. Not many people got to be engineers or poets or artists or whatever, but like we've kind of had this need to make things for survival for the most part. And it allowed these opportunities that weren't possible in other areas. So it seemed like this really potent source of meaning that could be explored. And my curiosity kind of just took me to to investigate further.
And throughout history, a lot of these things we do think of them as women's work. Of course, there are exceptions, but for the most part, women have been the people who have been making these particular textiles with their hands. And whether it's a necessity or not, this idea of looking at meaning, that we can go back and see somebody really did care about the meaning of this because they put a lot of effort into doing it well. You have just written a book called With Her Own Hands. And can you tell me a little bit about how this idea of meaning through making, through handwork, gave you a perspective on like a larger view of women's work in the world?
Yeah, people went way beyond what was necessary for survival, right? It was
Hmm.
not just, oh, I need a blanket and here's a plain weave blanket that I can use. There were designs, there was embroidery on top of it. Quilts are, yes, you've got the pieces but you could just put them together in any haphazard way to make them as quickly as possible. But people didn't. They made them in these very beautiful and complex ways. Maybe some were just get let me get done with this. They didn't like it and they had some other thing they wanted to go do instead. But yeah, it was really interesting to see these rich ways that women have extrapolated beyond and gone way beyond the necessary in order to express themselves, to express something about their culture. Of course, these textiles have been major transmitters of cultural ideas, religious ideas, documenting of stories and historical events. And they're these rich carriers of meaning. They say something about the world that people were living in, or who somebody is and what they believe in, or even just the colors that somebody likes, but it's a reflection of the self. And I think that these are really deep psychological needs that were getting expressed through through these textiles, needs for connection and community and expression and creativity and intellectual development. And, people want to push themselves and don't usually want to do the same thing over and over and over again. They want to learn the new thing. Oh, I figured this thing out and now I want to learn this thing. And this thing's harder. What if I did it this way? What would happen then? We really like to learn and grow and experiment. So yeah, it was just this like deep trove of potential and ways of kind of expressing these deeply important human needs. So it was quite an exploration to look into all this for the book.
And I tend to think of these things as being sort of time as being the scope, but you went and did what sounds like the most wonderful, exciting field research and spoke to people who are still living this kind of experience in broadly different cultures today. Can you tell me about some of your kind of more interesting or exciting or surprising case studies, I guess you'd call it?
Yeah. I mean, one of the best trips was Peru, being able to talk to weavers in remote parts of Peru who have been weaving and who have been weaving for generations and carrying on these weaving traditions. One thing that was a surprising moment and kind of an interesting moment, and it happened across women that I spoke to there. I would sometimes ask, what would you do if you couldn't weave anymore? And they truly could not answer this question. It was so deeply ingrained in who they were and what they did with themselves. The best that they could say is like, well, I would spin. Okay, well, if you couldn't spin, I guess I would tend the animals, I'd help process the wool. Like they could not imagine doing something that was not connected to weaving. And that's in such contrast to the way so many women and men who do this work in, say, the United States, who have chosen this, who for it, it's very much a choice and not a necessity or not any kind of like ingrained cultural experience. Sure, maybe your grandma did it, maybe your mom did it, but it's not like you could imagine probably if I couldn't do this, yes, I'd miss it, but I could think of a bunch of other things that I would do or choose as like a hobby or a, vocation. These women truly like could not fathom doing something else. And it just speaks, I mean, I think that historically that's probably the case, that this was such like a huge part of life and a huge part of the way life and time were organized and like how you saw yourself and your role in a community and everything, that like to imagine not doing it would be almost impossible. I mean, and knowing the amount of time that all of these things take to spin the wool needed, weave the cloth, then make the cloth into the various things that you need. I mean, it really would have been taking up 10 hours a day of mostly women's time. And yeah, how do you imagine some other life? It was really fascinating to think about it in that way.
And now a word from our sponsors. The Adirondack Woolen Arts Festival is the perfect way to spend a weekend surrounded by over 150 craft vendors in Greenwich, New York. Discover a curated group of vendors featuring the best of wool and artisan crafters. Throughout the weekend, enjoy workshops, free horse-drawn wagon rides, free kids' crafts, a fiber sheep show, and a sanctioned cashmere goat show. Join us September 21st and 22nd, 2024, and every fall. For more information, visit adkwoolenarts.com. That's adkwoolandarts.com. Appalachian Baby Design offers sustainably sourced yarns, kits, and patterns for crafting heirloom-quality gifts for the family. Their U.S. organic cotton and Shanico sportweight wool are soft, resilient, and washable, perfect for creating lasting pieces. Whether knitting, crocheting, or weaving, for beautiful creations that will be cherished for generations, start with AppalachianBaby.com. And now back to the show. And another thing about, the Peru example is that for those women, they couldn't imagine anything different, but for some people, we could very well imagine losing that as a culture. I mean, that's one of the things that Nilda Cayanyapa Alvarez, who's been a guest on the podcast before, she realized that we were going to lose that. And Irene Wagner, when she was in the Atlas, was like, well, there's hardly anybody doing this anymore. So it is kind of different when you have to make an effort to go back to this. You discover the meaning, but you also have to work at it and like teach yourself or find the time. It's not like your whole world is organized around it anymore.
Right. And the women that Nilda works with, of course, did have to relearn it. Many of them were disconnected from this heritage. And I loved her descriptions of how she had to go into the jungle and try to find the stuff that would make the colors that they thought were used, and like talking to the old grandmas before they passed, to try to get whatever knowledge was still held and then kind of experiment. That there, has been this real recreation, an effort to recreate these traditions as best as they can. And it's wonderful that work is happening, and it's sad that it's not happening everywhere, and that there is so much that has been lost over the centuries.
It's probably inevitable that your book is going to wind up getting compared to Elizabeth Whalen Barber's women's work, The First 20,000 Years, which is a pretty good comparison.
I'll take it. Like, absolutely honored.
But there's sort of different disciplines in the realm of social science. So archaeology, we study of people in time. And I'm not an expert on this, but this is my understanding. People through time. Anthropology is the study of larger groups of people. And I think that her work tends to fall more under those categories. Do you think that you approach this differently as a psychologist, which I know that you work in research and things in social psychology, but I tend to think of that as being more individual focused. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm actually a clinical psychologist, so I'm not even a social psychologist. And I am very interested in individual experiences. And when I got interested in this subject during the pandemic, when I thought, I'll read about this, I'm having this experience of having all of this meaning making in textile making, and I really want to understand this. So I thought I'd start reading about it. And her book was one of the first books I read, and it was so powerful and was a wonderful eye-opening experience and a wonderful place to start. But it still didn't satisfy my question, which was like, what might this work have meant for individual women? And there were parts in women's work that like hinted at it. She said something like, why would women spend all this time decorating and, extra time embellishing their work? Maybe it was to spend extra time with friends. Maybe like in the 5,000 years ago, imagining this like courtyard outrider kind of community that women would have been kind of like sitting around together while the men went out hunting and everything, with the children playing around them, communally caring for the children and talking with each other. And perhaps that it wasn't just about getting the work done. It was about spending the time together, right? So there are these little bits that were dropped in there, kind of her extrapolating or wondering about this. But like, that's what I really wanted to know. Like, were women 5,000 years ago experiencing a form of social connection and satisfying that need through shared textile work? So that was the thing that was hard to get at with what is currently written on this subject. And there were other things that touched on it. Subversive Stitch was another book that really was transformative when I read it, and almost made me feel like, oh gosh, do I need to write my book? Because she was a psychologist too, and really just hit on so much that spoke to the ways women have spoken their minds, really developed their sense of self through this and used it as a tool of rebellion, not just a, means to an end. But it still kind of didn't speak to like, how did women, any given woman 5,000 years ago, 100 years ago now, find meaning in this work, and what did it mean to them? So that was kind of what made me feel like, this is the book that I want to write. This is really what I want to research and understand. And so, some of that came through diaries that I found. Some of it came from speaking to women in the present, doing this work in many different cultural contexts and for many different purposes. And Some of it came from speaking to anthropologists and archaeologists and art historians and trying to just piece it together as best as I could from the examples that I found and the people that I talked to. And I think we don't know quite what humans were like 5,000 years ago and what was important to them. But I do think that there are certain kind of human needs that have been pretty consistent throughout history that we see by how they built their cultures and desire for religion, the desire for knowledge and to develop skills and hone things and make things better. And that I feel like, yeah, maybe we can kind of take what we know about what women are doing now in these many different contexts and think there must be some correspondence to what was happening back then, maybe in some different ways, or but that the human needs for connection, for creative expression, for developing skills and learning and growing and for having a voice, for feeling like you matter and like you have something to contribute, right? Like these are maybe common needs.
Yeah, I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about what those other needs that maybe aren't the first ones that we think of. Because when I think about what needs handwork is filling in my life, making socks is not a necessity. So that is on the list, but it's pretty far down. And there's a lot of talk about how knitting is the new yoga or knitting is mindfulness, et cetera. So there is a certain idea that knitting can help you slow down or experience more of your internal life. You've mentioned connection and things like that, but you sort of identified quite a few different ways that craft specifically is helping people meet their needs.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think some of these things might be hard to find in areas of our life as it is structured right now, right? Like the way that I was describing my experience as a psychologist and feeling like it was hard to ground myself in something tangible, right? Like in this very technological age, it is hard sometimes to find something tangible, something where you do feel like your efforts correspond to something that is like seen and real and that you can trust, that you can fix, that you can manipulate or, shape in this way. Like it feels really good to know that you can have an impact on something. And when we don't make things with our hands, I feel like we get kind of disconnected from that, like the churn of just responding to emails all day or kind of doing like having meetings, on Zoom or whatever. Like it doesn't feel always like it amounts to something.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that's something right now that is like maybe a particular moment in time and why these handcrafts have kind of had this resurgence and been so valuable and important and maybe speak to a need that was kind of taken for granted for a really, really long time and was just built into daily life for many people when working with your hands was more a regular part of life and you didn't have like microwave dinners and you had to actually like prepare a dinner or like grow your dinner.
I would get no knitting done if I had to grow my dinner.
No kidding. And you think of these women who did all of these
Oh, man.
things
Yeah.
and hand washed all the laundry and everything too.
The
Like, I
washing
don't,
machine is one of the major, major keystones of the liberation of women.
yes, 100%. I don't know how they did it either. And all I have to say is they really worked together a lot. It wasn't one woman in her home doing it all on her own as like a housewife, the way, it's been kind of set up in this fantasy of what the home was, that it was really this very communal effort to do these things because you couldn't churn your own butter, do your own laundry, spin all your own wool, grow all your own food, weave all your own cloth. Like it just wouldn't be possible for one person to do that to meet the needs of a entire family.
It's very interesting because craft for a lot of us these days is a really individual thing. I mean, you can choose to get together with other people for learning or for socializing or et cetera. But for a lot of us, it's something that you do on your own. And it has not always been that way. And it is not that way everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's still not that way. And it's really, I think, again, interesting the way that it plays out in different cultures. Because, yeah, in some places, it's still the case that women get together and spin, or women are spinning, like in Peru, everywhere they go, they're spinning, they're walking down the street and spinning. And it's really integrated into all interactions of your life. I interviewed one woman who just spun constantly while we talked and then showed me around her house and walked and spun, like there was never a moment that she wasn't spinning.
Right.
Um, and that would have been the way it was done. And so anything that somebody had to do, they did it while they were spinning or maybe weaving if they could be home and doing stuff at home. But yeah, it was so built into daily life. And now it's something, for us, it's something that's like, oh, I fit it into my day. I try to set aside a couple of hours or an hour, or I knit on the subway if I don't have any other time to carve out for it. But yeah, it's different. It's also such a privilege, I think, for many women and men to craft now. Like it is expensive. It is more expensive usually to knit a sweater than to buy a sweater or to make a quilt than it is to like buy a blanket from Walmart that serves a purpose of keeping you warm. That these things are privilege, whereas in so many times and places they were not. They were an absolute necessity, or they were the cheaper option. And most people couldn't afford anything else. So that there's so many ways that it's changed and that it's different for people in
Yeah.
different places and times now. It's really interesting.
And for some people, being good at a craft is an opportunity. It's not something that you spend your riches on. It's the way that you get your riches. That
Yeah,
there are still places where you support yourself through.
100%.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was one element of your book that I thought was really interesting. You talk about, I remember where there was subversive cross stitch, which tended to be a little bit sassy. And there have been, and there was a book called Craftivism a little while ago, but the idea that you could kind of change the world through your craft. And I'm curious if you can tell me a little bit about how that comes in your book.
I mean, I think that there are a lot of opportunities for using textiles, and there have been historically to speak your mind and to say something that you might not have had a lot of other opportunity to say. Thinking about times that women were not published writers for the most part, or didn't have a way of making their political leanings known, through the vote or by being actively involved in the political system of the community that they were in. They could make them known through their quilting or embroidery. They could speak their minds in these ways. And I think that that is powerful. Like knowing that you have a voice, being able to express yourself, to express that in some way, even if not a lot of people see it, even if not a lot of people know, even, right? I talk about in the book women who were making wig rose quilts to express their party lines during that period in history, like that even like many Tory husbands didn't know that they were sleeping under their wife's wig rose quilt, is such a fascinating way of a woman being able to say, like, even if you don't know, even if I'm going to speak in these kind of symbols or something, I'm going to make my beliefs known. I'm going to express what I feel and what I believe. I think that's really powerful. And I think we see in all of these ways people using textiles as a form of activism. I think even yarn bombing, being able to transform surfaces that are hard into surfaces that are soft and colorful, moving women's work out of the home and into these public spaces, claiming spaces for people to like look at things a little differently and say like that doesn't belong there, or like that's not where I'm used to seeing that. What is that about? I think that's all really powerful in kind of like shifting systems and saying like it doesn't have to be this way. Like what if all the trees on the street were covered with crochet granny squares? Like, I mean, that's the way that things could be. And would that be great? I think it's pretty great, but it's not what you're used to seeing. So I think that there's a way of disrupting things and disrupting in a way, I think I use these words in the book, that gently needles,
Mm,
maybe rather than is quite so in your face.
right.
The way that the women fighting for voting rights during the suffrage movement were using banners, applique banners. It was a way of using the tools they had available to them and using like the way they were used to expressing themselves to say, we want something different. We don't want to be sitting, stitching alone at home, like with no voice. Like we want to have a voice and we want our stitching to speak for us in the world and help us speak for ourselves. There's another example of the crazy quilt period and how this might have been like a way for women to kind of transition between the kind of more oppressive Victorian period of the late 19th century into the 20th century and the, suffrage movement and these things, that it was like, were women letting themselves be a little freer in their expression? Were they giving themselves some room to play and kind of throw everything at the wall and see what stuck? Was it a way that women could kind of find their voice, not working within these like more structured patterns and stuff, but in this freer way? It could be that these things helped women even transition to the point where they felt like, I do have something to say. I do have ideas. I do have my own way of thinking about things or putting things together. And I think that that's a really even empowering thing about beginning to make anything, to say, I can follow a recipe, or I can say, like, I don't really like nutmeg and I'm not going to add that in. Or I like a lot of nutmeg and I'm going to double the amount of nutmeg that it calls for. And where can we give ourselves some room to play and like make something our own? So I think that that's even like as a precursor to activism or speaking for ourselves, is knowing that you can, knowing that you do feel something, you do want something, you do have ideas. And then how far do you go? How far can you let yourself go in expressing those? So I don't know. I think textiles offer many ways into that.
Yeah. How did you decide on the structure of this book? Because, looking through it, you include stories from a wide variety of places, different voices, different crafts, and you're sort of looking at them by how you can see evidence of what the need it's using. But how did you tell me a little bit about how you decided to put this book together?
So from like the top level of how the chapters were decided was really thinking about like what are kind of key areas of meaning. So social connection, being able to earn an income, or whatever else that means, like being able to kind of have a voice or feel like your work has value, intellectual engagement, and kind of like being able to know yourself through your creative output. So these were areas that I felt like, okay, these are kind of key areas of meaning making and human needs, psychological needs. And then within that, it was a little bit more loose. I feel like, again, to kind of bring in a quilting parallel, that like I got a lot of information and then I kind of like worked with like, how do these things fit together? And I was a researcher for a long time. I still do a bit of psychology research, but I did a lot of mixed methods, so qualitative and quantitative. And so it was very much like kind of a qualitative data analysis of just like, okay, this is the data that I've got. These are the historical records that I found. These are the accounts from anthropologists. These are the personal accounts I got from interviews and everything. And now, like, how do I organize this and put it together? So the subheadings of the chapters are really kind of like how these things group together in meaningful ways that contribute to and flesh out this idea of the broader chapter heading. So again, by no means is it comprehensive. There's just no possible way that it could be, that I could ever kind of speak to all crafts or all cultures or all ways that meaning is created, there's still so much more that could be said. But it was the most kind of cohesive, coherent way of pulling together the data that I had and having it speak to these sources of meaning.
And, you know, you've mentioned a couple things about stitching together and gently needling. And the language that we're using to talk about these things is so heavily influenced by making things by hand. And, you know, language can be gendered, but, you know, it's not necessarily like these are terms, even if it was mostly the women who were knitting or stitching, everybody's using these words.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. I mean, they're an important part of kind of how we understood things in society. One of the things that I found that I loved that I did not quite know were all the parallels between needles filling holes with thread and sex.
okay.
Like, that was like a known that was a known kind of euphemism for sex or way of talking about sex. And
Okay.
that's kind of lost. We don't really use that metaphor or parallel anymore. But I loved that it was like so, yeah, that was like such a understood idea. It was something everybody would have seen and understood and could use as like a way of talking
That's funny.
about sex.
Very different type of creativity.
Yeah.
So at what point did you decide to sit down and turn this into a book? I mean, you've talked about how, you know, you were finding meaning through craft in your own life, but then at some point you decided, let's gather these things up and create them into a book. Can you tell me how that came about?
So it was, I did a lot of reading just to satisfy my own curiosity. And for a while, I thought, it would just be me investigating this for my own understanding. And then because I couldn't find quite what I was looking for, it made me want more. And then I thought, okay, well, I was a researcher for a long time. You do research that fills a gap in the literature. And so I felt like, oh, here's a gap. Here's a gap. And it's a gap that I'm really curious about and would be really interested in filling. And so that was kind of the beginning of, well, maybe I could write a book about this. And I've never written a book. And so it was kind of like, okay, now I need to figure out how to even do that and how to get an agent. And,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that it would actually happen
Mm-hmm.
because it can take years or you could never get an agent. And so I didn't really know for sure that I'd be able to make this happen. I feel incredibly fortunate that I did get to make it happen, but I felt enough of a pull to know these things for myself and to explore these ideas to work on it anyway. And so I put together a proposal. I started interviewing people. I knew that I was going to need to talk to people. And that was the best part of the
I
process,
bet.
honestly. Traveling and talking to people, but even Zoom conversations with people that I couldn't get to in person. And it was, again, kind of for my own personal satisfaction coming out of the pandemic and the isolation of that, and then kind of connecting with all of these mostly women, although I didn't interview some men, about something that meant so much to me and finding all this connection and areas of overlap and kind of building on each other's ideas. And I mean, that was just so incredibly meaningful to me and fulfilled something deeply needed at that time for connection for myself. So it was like so satisfying to do this that I just was like, I'm going to keep going. And then I had the proposal like halfway done. And I remember I was like, this is like, I'm going to get this done. This is the year, like we've all been vaccinated, like
Yep.
my kids are back at school, it's a new year. I'm really going to get this done. And 2 weeks later, I had a fire in my home
Oh no.
and we were displaced for 15 months.
Oh
So that
man.
was a bit of a setback, but I did get the proposal done at some point during, I think I maybe finished the proposal in like June and started shopping it to agents. And I was just very lucky to get an agent right away and a book deal very soon after that. And then I was given a year to really write the book. So I had already started to do some research. I had already done some interviews. I had gone to Peru, I had gone to Iceland and done some of this research. I kind of like tied in trips that I would really like to take to
Yes.
like, oh, here's a place that I could talk to a bunch of people. And I've really been wanting to go there. So even if I don't end up getting to write this book, like I've gotten to go somewhere that I really wanted to go and explore the textile traditions there. So it was really, yeah, like I enjoyed it. I wanted to do it. And I was hopeful that I could turn it into an actual book. But that was, yeah, not fully within my own control, but I was lucky.
Well, and part of the reason I'm curious about this and I've been asking about this is that, we often talk about writing as a craft, and there are so many ways in which the process of interviewing people and putting this together parallels the process of making something with your hands. I mean, it's just in this case, you were making something with your hands on the keyboard.
Yeah.
But that interplay between doing something personally and doing something to share with the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that also feels so geez bend women who would like hang their quilts out on the wash lines to or the fences of their homes to show people as they pass by. Yes, there was like a very a wonderful feeling of being able to communicate ideas and share it with people. Again, I think maybe even heightened by the pandemic and the kind of isolation at that time and feeling kind of disconnected from a broader world to kind of be able to speak with all these people and then share these stories, share these experiences, share these thoughts with the world is really so meaningful. And there were a lot of parallels with crafting the book and crafting, as I found, as I was explaining with the way I organized stuff, it really felt like I was kind of like moving pieces of fabric around to see like, how do these fit together? Okay, this is what I've got. This is the pile of, scraps or pieces that I
Mhm.
have. And then mixing them up and going, does that go there? No, that doesn't work there. That goes here. But is that now too similar to that? Do I need both of those pieces? Like, is it too much yellow? Like, move that out, move one of those out. There were a lot of parallels with that. And then I also have never written in this way before. I'm used to writing research papers, which are very structured and, allow for some room to do your own thing, but follow a kind of clear format. And this was really like creating my own pattern for something that I had never made before and trying to figure out, oh, like, how do I make this thing that is totally new to me and I don't have like a real guidebook for? So that was also a really new and challenging experience and had a lot of parallels to crafting.
And it is an interesting hybrid because it's researched. So it's not just a sort of a narrative, but there is a storytelling sort of element to it. There's a you're here we go again. You're following a thread.
Yes. Many
Yeah.
threads. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and there was a parallel in even finding people to interview where every time I'd interview somebody, they'd say like, "Oh, you should talk to this person," or "Have you heard of this person's work?" or "I know them and I could put you in touch." And so I felt also like I got to follow threads between people and it led me to places that I wouldn't have known. So there was something kind of extemporaneous about that where I couldn't have known at the outset. It's not like I had a list of like, okay, here are the 50 people I'm going to interview, and I'm going to interview this person because they do lace, and I'm going to interview this person because they do crochet, and this person because they do activism through embroidery. And I was like, hey, you do work that's interesting to me, or like, I came across a paper that you wrote about women in Indonesia and would you talk to me? And then they're like, oh, and then you should talk to this person. And if who does work that would be really in line with your thinking is this person, or who talks about it in a really rich, meaningful way. It was just it was such an exploratory, wonderful path. And again, relying on the generosity of people to connect me with people and speak to me. I think that speaks to something you've talked about on your show before too. And just this desire for people within the community to like help each other and teach each other, that there is a lot of support
Hmm.
for learning skills or, helping each other in this area. It's really so meaningful, and you don't find that in a lot of places.
And I think that crafters sometimes have a different relationship with the meaning in their work. Like, there's a lot of feeling around not your grandmother's XYZ. There are a lot of feelings about that. And, some of us kind of feel maybe apologetic, or that it's not congruent with a sort of a modern outlook, or some people are just really enthusiastic about it. But it's kind of interesting to think about not only what we do, but how we talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And you
Yeah. And
professionally listen to how people talk about things.
right. Yeah. And the ways that like your identity gets shaped with that, like what does it mean for you to say it's not your grandma's ex versus like, oh, I'm like so happy to have it be a grandma hobby. Like
Hmm.
I'm like all ready to be that
Hmm.
and embrace that. Like that there are different ways of relating to it and engaging with it in terms of, yeah, what you want it to mean about yourself, or what you're afraid it will mean about yourself or something. Like it's interesting how it gets tied up in these things. I mean, that I think that's how it's gotten tied up with like femininity or, obedience or passivity or something. Like this is fascinating, right? These are so not actually things that make for good needlework or, textile work. Like it's funny how these things kind of get put on it, and then we have to like feel a need to shake them off or something. Like my mom made a comment to me once. I was always such a, feminist kid. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. I was always like, I'm never going to be like you. Um, sorry, mom. But, like I was like, I want a career. I remember when I was applying to college, my grandmother was like, oh, why put your parents through all this paying for college? Like, I'll put you through beauty school and you can be a beautician. I was like, oh
Wow.
my God, grandma, have you met me? Like, I I don't like, no, I will never be that. Like I'm an academic, like I want to get a PhD, like I have all these, I read nonstop, like I get straight A's. How could you think that like I would not go to college and that my path is not this? So my mom said to me once, like, oh, it's so funny. You're such a feminist and everything, but like you love baking, you love knitting, you love being at home, you're such a homebody, like all of these things. And it's like, oh, but can't you see how those things are different when I do that? Like it doesn't mean
Oh.
what you
Hmm.
think it means just because it like seems like the kind of thing that like a housewife would do or something in your mind. Like it has such different meaning for me. Like and we get so flattened, I think, by these associations or these connections with stereotypes or, ideas about what something means, like when it can mean so many things. And also, like, I'm a full person, I do, yes, want to bake a pie. I love baking pie. And I also want to write a great research paper or get $1 million grant. like they're like, these things can coexist and they're not in conflict with each other. They don't need to be in conflict with each other. And like we put them into conflict with each other. So just because some grandmas crochet doesn't mean that crocheting is a grandma
Right.
hobby, like it can mean totally different things. And
But it can also bring people together from all of those different areas, which I think is unusual and special at this point. I'm thinking about a spinning group I am friends with, and in there we have a radiologist, a retired high tech project manager, a short haul trucker, and a hairstylist who worked on military bases. And these are not people who would come together anywhere except through their craft.
yeah, I know. I think that's amazing. And you always have something to talk about.
Hmm.
You can, even if you have very different political views or
Hmm.
ideas about whatever, like you can talk about your weaving, you can talk about your knitting. I love that. It offers such and for the people who do it, it's so rich and meaningful. It's rare that you meet somebody that's just like, yeah, I quilt, but it's like a whatever. Like I'm not really that into it. Like you, you don't, you don't hear that, like people just don't do it. Either you're into it or you're not
Hmm.
into it,
Right.
because to be into it does require so much time and energy. And I guess there are people who like pick up knitting once every winter and like knit one hat and like that's their knitting for the year and it's kind of a novelty thing. But for the most part, especially if you're going to like a social gathering that's for that thing, you're into it. So then it offers like so much area because then it connects to all these different parts of who you are and what it means to you. And so there's so many deep areas of connection then. I love that. And I love the approachability of it too. Like if I'm knitting on the subway and somebody's knitting across from me, like immediately we're like, what are you making? Or like, hey, like that's nice yarn.
Yeah.
Like it immediate, like it's rare that you would not talk to each other. There'd almost be something wrong with you not talking to each other. And that's not true for other things. Like if two people are reading on the subway, they're not going to be like, oh, like you're reading and I'm reading. Look at that.
Well, it's also quite validating. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's so appealing to teach somebody how to do it. That I had this joke that if you say that you are interested in learning to spin, people will bring you spindles and fiber and, that you will be aspinerated. And that sort of here become part of the tribe. And also I find it meaningful to help other people become part of it.
Absolutely. My favorite thing is teaching people how to knit
Mhm.
because it means so much to me. So to me, it's like, oh my gosh, like you want to take this gift that I have to give that like, it feels like the greatest gift ever because it's been so transformative in my own life that,
Mhm.
yeah, it feels like such an honor to get to teach somebody and like give them this thing that
Yeah.
can be so much.
So how has working on this book changed your own handwork?
So it's introduced me to a lot of different types of handwork. I was really primarily a knitter. I did some sewing throughout I really came to all of this in my 20s. So I was not doing this stuff when I was a kid growing up. But I did some sewing. I kind of always wanted to be a quilter, but never actually could manage to finish a quilt or even come very close. I'd make like a couple blocks and be like, okay, I don't know. I don't know that this is for me. It's like so much precision cutting and yeah. So I really wanted to try my hand at a lot of different things as part of this and like know what the different things felt like. So I did try embroidery, cross stitch, kind of tried weaving. Weaving is hard and not something you can really like dabble in. I
Oh,
would like to.
I would see here. I'm like, oh, I have a craft for you. Sorry, please continue. I will rate you later.
I will, yeah, I would love to really learn to weave, but I tried bits of it and yeah, feel like it's the tip of a very large iceberg.
That's true. That's true.
And I did try quilting and actually finished a quilt, both a machine made like blanket quilt and also English paper piecing hand sewn pillowcase cushion. And yeah, I mean, I tried spinning. I had done some natural dyeing before I had kids,
Hmm.
and then not a lot of time for natural dyeing with little kids. But I tried some more natural dyeing, including indigo dyeing, which I really enjoyed and would love to do more of. So it really has broadened my interests, and I found that I really do like other things besides knitting too. Knitting is my first love and what feels most natural in my hands. But it's expanded me a lot. And I feel like I've learned different things offer different satisfactions. And some things you can find the same kinds of satisfactions in somewhat different ways. But like the softness of knitting, you don't really find in embroidery or cross stitch. It's not like a tactilely satisfying experience in the same way as knitting is. And yeah, hand sewing feels like it fits into my lifestyle better than machine sewing because I can do it kind of in this more portable way. It doesn't take up a lot of space. I don't have like a giant studio space in my home. I envy these, like when I see quilters with just these like giant tables and stuff, I'm like, oh, well, that's how you like are able to do this, because having a smallish table, you can't lay out all of your stuff. And like, how do you cut when you can't lay out your piece fully when you're making a quilt? And that was all tricky stuff for me to figure out without the proper setup and space. So there were things like that I don't know, I really learned about what fits into my life and what do I enjoy and what offers me the different types of experiences that I need and want. It's been a fun exploration of that. And I feel like I've needed to do that hands-on. The way Elizabeth Wayland Barber in Women's Work kind of opens the book talking about weaving a fragment that she had found or that existed in a collection from like, I don't know what it was, 10,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago, that had been preserved in a bog or something. And she had to weave it to know how the structure actually worked. And the way she set up the loom the first time was wrong and had to undo it because like she had set up the warp as the weft and the weft as the warp. And it was actually the reverse. And she couldn't have known that unless she actually wove it. So it's those kinds of things. It's not like that was absolutely necessary for my book the way it was necessary for her work as an archaeologist, but it definitely helped me gain an understanding of kind of what do these different things offer, and why are people drawn to certain crafts over others. And
do you now have more time for craft now that it's finished, or have you found something else to fill the space?
No, I do have more time, and that was really a joy of finishing the book. And I would post on Instagram each time I finished like a big thing in the book. Like I finished my first draft and sent it off to the publisher, and like now I get to like cast on this new project, or now I've like finished this revision and now I get to like start cutting the pieces for this quilt, that each thing like got finished and I'd be like, ooh, here's the thing I want to make now.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, it definitely was like a joy to get to do these things when these big lifts for the book were done. And I had at times, a stretch between when I'd get the revisions back from my editor or something, and I'd have like a glorious 2 months without, book writing being like 10 hours of every day. And now there's been a little bit more to do for promotion and everything, and I haven't had quite as much time, but I'm actually excited that some of the events that I'm doing for the book are at knitting stores, and it's like we're all going to sit around and knit together, and I get to merge these things. Like promoting the book while knitting is really fits.
Well, Nicole, thank you so much. I've really loved dipping into your book, and I hope other folks will love it too.
Thank you so much, Anne.
Thanks to our sponsors for supporting the podcast. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.